Europe is also considering sending its contingents, as I said, to Ukraine, which we have already declared will be considered a legitimate military target, are trying to promote security guarantees for Ukraine, which are formulated without our participation, and frankly, in the context of creating military threats to the Russian Federation. Imagine if some part of Ukraine becomes a territory where so-called peacekeepers are stationed, and will there be Western security guarantees for this part of Ukraine, the former Ukraine, for this territory aimed against the Russian Federation? There was a very negative reaction to the meeting in Alaska. The European leaders immediately rushed to Washington and tried, while demonstrating their loyalty, nevertheless, with sophisticated methods, not allow the Trump administration to move towards facilitating a real settlement rather than increasing sanctions pressure, which still makes no sense and has no decisive impact on Russia's economy, and by supplying the Zelensky regime with weapons, and recently also by forming certain peacekeeping, but in essence occupation forces, through talks about creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Right now there is a discussion about whether it is possible to shoot down objects over Ukraine from the territory of neighboring countries, or if it is necessary to wait until these objects approach the border. You know, this reminds me, we have had such great satirical writers, Ilf and Petrov, and in one of their novels they described how people they gather, this is at the beginning of Soviet power, gather in public places and just start discussing politics, the politics of France, Britain, the Soviet Union, which had just been created then. And these writers characterize them as peak vests. That is, people who are not responsible for anything but like to portray themselves as major figures and talk about matters in which they are unable to make any decisions. Europe is clearly trying quite brazenly to reclaim a place at the negotiating table. However, from the position it advocates, from the position of revanchism and inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, there is, of course, nothing to do at the negotiating table. Europe is also considering sending its contingents, as I said, to Ukraine, which we have already declared will be considered a legitimate military target, and are trying to promote security guarantees for Ukraine, which are formulated without our participation, and frankly, in the context of creating military threats to the Russian Federation. Imagine if some part of Ukraine becomes a territory where so-called peacekeepers are stationed. And will there be Western security guarantees for this part of Ukraine, the former Ukraine, for this territory aimed against the Russian Federation? What is that? This will mean only one thing, that the West has occupied, I will say again, Ukraine. And if no changes occur in Ukraine's legislation, it will mean that on this territory occupied by the West, Western military units are protecting the Nazi regime. And in this territory, laws are in effect that prohibit the Russian language in all areas of life and ban the canonical Ukrainian church. This is what the West is protecting and what it is trying to achieve, and we will insist that, of course, there are security guarantees. We sought this in February of 2014, and then a year later, when we agreed upon and approved the Minsk agreements at the United Nations, and security guarantees must fully comply with the commitments of the West enshrined in the United Nations Charter and in the consensus documents of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in Istanbul in 1999 and in Astana in 2010. The security guarantees, as agreed at the time, should be based on the principle of indivisible security and on the principle according to which no country has the right to strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. This is exactly what the West is trying to do in Ukraine now, attempting to save it from complete collapse.